Greetings, friends. My name's Sean, and I am a professional miniature sculptor. Today, I'm sculpting a Treeman for the game Relicblade. I sculpt my miniatures in ZBrush, so the first step is to set up my workplace. ZBrush is fully digital, but I'm building toward a figure that will exist in real life. So I need to create a framework for scale. Previously, I sculpted one other Arbaleth character for Relicblade. So my first step was to load up the old Arbaleth as a reference point. To create the workspace, I am going to load in the 40mm base from the old Arbaleth sculpt, and that will help define the overall scale for the project. Then I'm going to load in a spherender. Spherenders are part sphere, part cylinder, and it's a basic shape that I've really been enjoying working with lately. It's a kind of a little clay tube I can have set aside. It's ready to shape into a head. It's ready to shape into an arm. It's really very useful subtool for various types of deformation, and you always have to choose what to start with, and I used to always work from a sphere, but I find the straight center section gives me a really nice work shape. So let's start with phase one, blocking in. So when I am building a figure, I have to block in all of the shapes. I tend to think about the figures a little bit like an action figure, like an old G.I. Joe action figure, where you have like an upper torso, a lower torso, upper arm, lower arm. Each of those things give me a really nice solid subtool to work with that I can then pose the figure from. So looking at the concept art and also holding the image of this character in my mind, I work my way through blocking out the entire figure. I block out the torso, the head, the arms, and the legs, and I use the clay buildup tool and the trim dynamic tool to kind of just mash the shapes into the general forms I need. This stage is very loose, but also very specific as far as considering the pose and also thinking about the mold that's going to be used later on. So getting everything into place is really important. And I don't worry about detail at this step. However, my first consideration of detail is the head. I really like to sculpt the head, sculpt the face, and get a better idea of what the character is like. I don't work from very detailed concept art since all of the characters are my own designs, and I can take a little bit of extra time during the sculpting process to get to know the character, and they're all really springing from ideas that I already have living in my imagination. So it's not as complicated as trying to work from someone else's design because I'm not beholden to source material. Like if I was sculpting Han Solo, I would need to make sure it looks like Han Solo, but in this case, Wise Gwyn is a character of my own creation and primarily exists in my imagination. And so I can do the artwork illustration and know what his back looks like because I know what his back looks like. I don't have to tell a sculptor what his back looks like. Anyways, this step of doing a more detailed work on the face is really for me to prime my creative pump and get my blood flowing, start thinking about the character and getting to know the character a little bit more on like a personal level. Whereas you might not do this right away if you were working to create a one-to-one copy from source material. So with the head in place, I can start worrying about the other parts of the body that I haven't blocked in yet. And that's particularly the leaf beard and the tree mullet. So even at the earliest points of this, I have to keep the mold in mind. My miniatures are all produced with 2-part molds. That's not the case if you're sculpting straight into for 3D printing. I'm sculpting for production of metal miniatures, and so I have to be really careful to accommodate the mold. If I do a sculpt that has too many undercuts, it will destroy the mold and it'll cost me extra money to replace, and people will get a lower quality figure in the end. So even from these earliest steps, I'm thinking about mold making. And if you are interested in me going into detail about how to sculpt for molds, be sure to leave a comment for that. So knowing I'm aiming for a 2-part mold, and knowing I want my miniatures to be easy to assemble and as few parts as possible, I know I want this one to be the body and the hand. Those will be 2 separate parts. Now, the large claw, the war claw on this character, adds a lot of layers, but it's also fundamental to the character's backstory. So I'm going to, rather than cast the miniature in one part, I'm going to add the second part so I can have that big war claw hand that he's sort of, holding close to himself. He's sort of precious about it, or self-conscious about his warlike transformation. So these early blocking in steps, I'm very concerned about pose. I can't really say this enough. The pose of the figure is super important, and without a good pose, no matter how cool the details are, if the pose is wonky, the figure is going to be wonky. And we don't want a wonky figure. We want it to be cool. So early on, I'm making sure that I'm adjusting, the angle of each leg. I'm making sure the foot is in the right place, making sure his balance is proper, that he looks confident, or that he is expressing a lot of his character in the way he's posed. All right, guys, we did it. Phase 1 is complete. The main blocking in is done, and we're ready for phase 2, where we start to refine the details. So I take a little bit of time to analyze the level of detail on the original Arbaleth character sculpt. I want to make sure that the detail level I sculpt on this is going to match the scale and style of the Relicblade range. And, I normally am sculpting humanoid style, human scale characters, whereas these Arbaleth are quite a bit bigger and also have fantastical anatomy. So I want to make sure that the amount of detail in the bark is similar on each of the Arbaleth characters. The Arbaleth tree folk have kind of thick bark-like skin, almost like armor plating. And the irregular armor plating has gaps for flexibility. So I kind of imagine how they would be able to move, even though they're a mixture of rigid and fluid movement. I'll keep this fantasy anatomy in mind as I work my way through the entire figure. It's a really fun opportunity for me to be pretty creative with the shapes and patterns and things that will evoke the bark-like texture, while also creating fun details to paint as you work on your Arbaleth miniature. Okay, in a lot of my other videos, I just do a quick voiceover of speed 1000% of my sculpts, but this one I want to take a moment to talk about my technical ZBrush process. The general steps I follow when I'm sculpting are, working from general to specific, thinking a lot about form. It uses a lot of my mental energy and my creative processing power. If I was a computer, I'd be running on overdrive, running out of RAM and just really spending. Sculpture requires a lot of understanding form and volume and anatomy, composition, details. All of that is just the very beginning of the process of sculpture. All of that is very theoretical and requires a lot of study and years of experience. And don't be afraid of that reality. Just know that you'll continue getting better the more you do it. The more you study, the more you draw, the more you sculpt, it's going to get easier and more fun, and new realms will get unlocked in your imagination. But there is a level of fundamental, how do you move from a blob to a detailed thing, that I just want to talk about the tools, actual tools I'm using to mush these digital pixels into place. So starting from the beginning, I start with the basic shape. I've got this sphere that I've sort of mushed into, let's say, a forearm, an upper arm, a leg. And then I want to Dynamesh it. Dynamesh is a process that creates a uniform level of resolution across the whole piece. And if it's low resolution, it'll be very crunchy when you try and carve it. And then if it's very high resolution, it'll cut really deep and smooth, but it'll be hard to make big changes because it's so reactive. So you want to create a resolution of your Dynamesh so that your tools are reacting in a way that feels comfortable to you, especially at this earlier sculpting step. You want that level to give you a reaction that makes it so your work is effective. You don't want to be scrubbing to just make a small change, and you don't want to have the whole thing get smashed the second you touch it with a tool. So it takes a little bit of feel, and because the size of the shape is different, will react differently at different resolutions. I can't tell you an exact resolution to set it to, but try the slider a little bit and figure out where the tools are reacting how you want. Okay, next, we're going to be creating the general volumes. And for that, I use the clay buildup brush. That clay buildup tool it's a pretty aggressive tool, and pressing the Option key, at least on Mac, which I'm working from, switches from add to subtract. And so you're able to switch from adding material to subtracting material. And with that, I tend to just build up the volumes. I'm thinking more about the greater volumes. Next, I switch to trying to define those volumes in kind of a stylized way. My preferred tool for that is called Trim Dynamic. Trim Dynamic. It's a little bit fun because the way it reacts to the angle of the shape versus the angle you're approaching it from can be surprising and exciting, and I really like that. You could use a hard polish or something else if you want to be a little more controlled, but I like the Trim Dynamic. It's very aggressive and works well for my style. So I use that to shape and create the stylized graphic shapes that will be really fun to paint and describe the material. The stylization process is just like in drawing, where it's heavily dependent on the type of material you're trying to represent. So if I were sculpting cloth or steel armor plates, or in this case bark musculature, it's going to require a different kind of treatment, and that's a very creative interpretation. But at this step, I'm taking the volumes that I built up with the clay buildup tool and smashing them and polishing them into a more stylized shape. Okay, this last one is I'm using a custom brush called Orb Cracks. I've been using Orb Cracks since I started sculpting in 2015. I can't remember who made it, but it is a real gift to my style of sculpting. So with this, it's a very sharp edged tool. It's a little bit like Dam Standard, which is a fine detail point that you can cut into the shapes with. This one gives it a wider angled edge, a little bit like, instead of using a needle tool, it's a little more like a wider rubber sculpting tool blade that if you were using traditional. Anyway, so using Orb Cracks, I like to refine the details by cutting in. This is primarily a cutting in tool. In limited applications, I use it as an additive in order to create steps. And later in this sculpt, you'll see me do that quite a bit with the leaves. Okay, once I've done that, I'm switching back and forth between the add and subtract all throughout the whole process. So each of these three tools that I use the most, the clay buildup, the Trim Dynamic, and the Orb Cracks, react differently to being either used as additive or subtractive, and that's modified using the Option key. So you just do it on the fly, whether you're pressing the button on the keyboard or on the tool to do it. I think it's Option. Gosh, if I'm saying the wrong hotkey, please forgive me. So each of those brushes behave differently, and it's going to be a matter of experience to know which tool you want to do. Now, working in ZBrush, if you're just getting started, is going to feel very technical. You're going to be very focused on the controls, on, centering the figure so you can even see it, trying to figure out what material you like working with that's easy to look at, and which tools you're actually going to use, because there are tons of different brushes for a wide variety of applications. So getting to know the program is going to take some time, but I want to encourage you, it's a lot like playing a video game, where at a certain point you're going to stop thinking about what button you press to throw a grenade. You see a certain type of monster and you're able to swap to the armor piercing weapon. You see an enemy far away and you pull up the scope. With working in ZBrush, you're not even going to be thinking about it at a certain point. You're going to know what tool, how it'll behave, what shapes you're going to use, and it's going to be a very creative process. So once you get through those early learning the control steps and start focusing on which weapon loadout you like, if we're using a video game analogy further, you're going to start being able to work through the process. Now, in this figure, it's Arboleth with bark musculature, so it's very open to interpretation, fantastical. It's humanoid, insecty, like Treeman. So in this magical bark really gives me a lot of fun space to work. So the process from here, once I've blocked in the figure, is really to just work through each part one at a time. I'm working through the arms, working through the torso, working through the legs, the lower leg, the upper leg, everything one step at a time. And sometimes you'll end up using symmetry on some models, to create a breastplate that is symmetrical, but a lot of organic shapes are going to require not using the symmetry tool at all, but really sculpting specifically with things in place. Now, sculpting this miniature was a lot of fun, and I spent a lot of time mentally rendering and then sculpting and refining details. Just anytime I see a spot that I want to jump to, I just jump to it and sculpt. I use orb cracks for cutting in those details. I use the trim dynamic to smooth out sharp edges and create a very stylized look. Part of the posing process is always keeping an eye on the silhouette of the figure. Now, the silhouette's going to matter a lot for the aesthetics of the figure when you're looking at it, and it's also going to matter a lot for mold alignment, because, again, we have to worry about that two-part mold. And each time I'm sculpting a figure, I'm thinking about how those parts are going to fit into the mold, and also it gives me a really good opportunity to think about the silhouette of the miniature. I like to align the figure so when I snap the figure to look at it head on, that it's lined up with how I'm going to have the mold. That way I can keep track of overhangs and undercuts and things like that. And, that silhouette is also going to be really important for storytelling about the character. It's been said a lot about cartoon characters. You think about the shape of Bart Simpson's head with his spiky hair and stuff, how he's super recognizable just from the outline, or Mickey Mouse with the three circles, his head and his ears. It's just as important with 3D models, and it's very obvious when you see a miniature that they haven't considered that, unfortunately. When there's no good angle to photograph a model from, that's the problem. So we're always thinking about that sweet silhouette even when we're making 3D miniatures. So I try to accentuate any shapes that'll bring out Gwyn's personality as I'm sculpting this character. Now, I spent a lot of time working on the hands of this character. The war claw is a key feature of Wise Gwyn's call to adventure, because he used to not have that big war claw, and then it grew. And so as much of the story that comes from that big war claw also comes from the non-war claw hand. So I'm trying to make sure that both of those give a lot of personality and a little bit of background for people that are paying attention to that sort of thing. Sculpting this guy is very rewarding because this character exists in my imagination primarily, and that nebulous imagination is taking shape as it comes into form. And that's one of the things that's so wonderful about sculpting miniatures and creating art like this. Okay, so with the body, Mostly done with the detail. I jump into his accessories. I've got to do his staff and his tree beard. The staff is a pretty simple design. It's like a piece of living wood that Wise Gwyn uses as a druidic focus. I'm going to assume he uses it as a walking stick also when he's striding across the land as a majestic, aged hippie. Okay, so speaking of being an aged hippie, it's time to work on his long, luxurious, leafy beard and his beautiful mullet. So the leafy details are quite fiddly. The way I do it is I'm careful to define the overall shape and composition of his leafy beard before I sculpt any of the detail. And this would be the same with any kind of hair. Like, you really want to get the volumes right before you start detailing it. Otherwise, the move tool is going to create some pretty gross deformations in the shape. So I made the mustache and beard as separate subtools so it'd have good definition between them, and I can move them to make sure there's enough depth later on if I need to. The process of sculpting leafy beard started with the big, crunchy, chaotic shapes. Once the foundation was in place, I used the clay buildup to define actual individual leaves, like create bumps where each leaf would be. And then I used the orb crack tools, first with the additive to create the outline, and then the subtractive to cut in underneath each leaf. And that gave me a quick workflow to just define each leaf, sculpt, cut, and that I worked through the leaves in little bunches to try and create a more organic and natural look to the leaves. I can imagine someone creating a leaf shape subtool and then bundling it into foliage and then duplicating it across the figure, and that would be very detailed, more detailed than this, and potentially come out with a nicer look in the end. But I feel like it's important for me to be able to keep track of that 2-part mold all the way through, making sure I'm not getting any undercuts I have to fix later, and also I can align the leaves so that they will line up with the mold during the demolding process. So I'm thinking about molds, I'm thinking about composition, and I'm thinking about each individual leaf as I work my way through. Now that I finished his beard, it's time to do Wise Gwyn's long mullet. It goes from the top of his head all the way down. For whatever reason, I decided to start at the top. You got to start somewhere. And I just worked one clump of leaves at a time, creating each leaf and sculpting it all the way down to his knees. The last accessory for our tree man are his little branches on his spine. For whatever reason, I created these little fin branches on the arboleth, and so they've got to happen. Guys, we made it to phase 3, and that's engineering for print. I had a pretty good idea early on about how many parts I was going to make this miniature. I'm always really careful to make sure my miniatures are as few parts as possible. I really prefer a one-piece metal miniature. I just love it. They're fun to paint. The details that are on there are important. You don't have to paint underneath behind a part of the piece that is invisible just for the sake of it being possible. You really have a very intentional design to the figures when you keep it as few pieces as possible. So I knew I would have the war claw as a separate piece and the body, and then the branches are going to need to be separate as well. Now, this step really involves merging together the subtools for each part that's going to be like a primary part of the miniature, and blending those together, and then making sure it will cast cleanly and that the separate parts will assemble together. This part is a little bit mind-bending, where you're duplicating and subtracting parts, you're merging pieces and shaping them and making sure it all fits together and lines up with the molds. And just trust me, it takes some doing and some mental capacity to do. I could, if there was some demand, I could make a detailed video about just this process, but let's not get too off in the weeds about it now. Just trust me that I'm aligning it all. So now that the miniature is all cut into the parts that I want, and cleaned up for casting. I'm going to align the parts so that they're ready to print as I want. Now, the Relicblade range is produced in metal, and I personally, Sean himself, have to go through each of the miniatures and sort them into packaging to ship around the world to collectors. That process takes quite a bit of work, and so what I'm going to do is make sure that each of the branches and the hand are sprued together. So I'm going to create a little sprue so that they're cast as one part. Instead of having to dig through a bag for each branch and figure out which branch is the top branch and which branch is the lower branch, I'm going to make sure they're all just together on one piece. And this is something that it's pretty useful for those of us that have to do the physical labor of sorting miniatures. You could save some money by having them all separate and not paying for the metal that people will clip off and throw away. But I know the labor is going to cost quite a bit more than the metal that gets thrown away. All right, we did it. Freaking sweet. There's Wise Gwyn himself, a beautiful tree man with beautiful, luxurious leaves. Make sure to like and subscribe. Next time, I'll be sculpting a gnome witch on a broomstick. So if you want to see a cute little gnome get sculpted up, just keep an eye on the channel. Yeah, Relicblade is a miniatures game that I make, and you can find it at relicblade.com. There's lots of stuff to explore. I've been making the game for almost 10 years now. Support an independent game creator and play a really wonderful miniatures game. Okay. Stay safe out there. Have fun. Be sure to play some Relicblade right away.